Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a slightly different edition of our weekly webinar. As we highlighted in the very first week of this, we fully expected there to be a few technical issues along the way, and today's the first time we've stumbled across one of those. We have, however, in true Pro Manchester fashion, managed to scrabble around and find an alternative that we hope will work just as well for you. So instead of this going out as a planned live broadcast, it is going out as a recorded Teams chat, and we'll share it out on the YouTube channel as normal. Chris from Grayling very kindly has said that he's still more than happy to answer any questions. So if at whatever point you are watching this, if there's any questions that you would like Chris to address, please send them through. I'll be sharing out the details later on. Or also, of course, just get in touch with Pro Manchester if there's anything that you'd like us to cover in future webinars. We are very open to hearing all of your ideas, your concerns, and to get an idea of what matters to you as individuals and businesses. We've said, I think, every week that a lot happens in a week at the moment, and that is certainly true again. Not only do we have everything that is going on around the COVID-19 crisis, not least the fact that at the time of recording, the Prime Minister is still in intensive care, but we have what would have been the big news story of the week, which is a new Labour leader, a new shadow cabinet, and that is something that is perhaps not even making it into the headlines. So I'm delighted that today we're also going to be joined by Sue Heyman, Senior Advisor at Grayling, but also former Secretary of State for DEFRA, who will be able to give us some insights into what's happening at the moment and what are some of those kind of implications that we might see in the handling of the crisis going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Chris for his usual weekly update.
Thanks, Ilona. Yes, again, reiterate what Ilona's just said. Sometimes things don't always go quite to plan, but we still make it work. So today, those of you who haven't watched one of our updates before, this is very much a summary of the news that's come out in the last week around COVID-19 from the government and also locally in Greater Manchester. So these are on the back of our daily briefings that we put out. If you're not yet receiving our daily briefings, please just let me know and more than happily add you to our list. I know some people got in touch last week asking for it, so hopefully you've now been added. So just to summarise what we're going to go through quickly, I'll go through some of the latest news from Greater Manchester, then I'll go on to the national news and then a little bit of international insight as well. And then, as Ilona mentioned, I'll kindly pass over to Sue, who's going to have a chat with us about the Labour leadership and the new shadow cabinet, particularly what that means for the COVID-19 crisis and also things for you as businesses to be thinking about going forward. So let's start with Greater Manchester to start with. First of all, we've got some very sad news to begin with that came out yesterday, and sadly the passing of Councillor Sue Murphy, who has been the deputy leader of Manchester City Council for the last 10 years. Sue is a huge loss to the city, the region and nationally. She's been an absolutely amazing individual fighting for social justice and being an outstanding councillor for the city. And I'm sure we all want to pass on our best to her family and the wider Manchester Council and everyone who's worked with her in the past. I was lucky enough to only ever meet her actually once when I was working in local government in Greater Manchester, and there wasn't a kind of person you will not hear a bad word said about her. So very sad news to start with. Going on to the COVID-19 update around Greater Manchester as well. We've seen announcements this week on two main real issues in Greater Manchester. The first is the availability of mental health support in Greater Manchester. The Mayor, Andy Burnham and Richard Leese have announced a new service of child and adult support online and digitally for people who have concerns around their own mental health or other people's mental health during the crisis. All that's available through the Combined Authority and the City Council's website. It's something that they've been working on for a while, but they are very, very acutely aware of the issues of mental health whilst we're all self-isolating and trying to social distance at the moment. The other big announcement and big activity that they've been doing in Greater Manchester has been the United We Stream GM launch that that's taken place. For those of you who aren't aware of it, this is a programme of activity led by Sasha Lord and the Mayor, where they are holding live events and broadcasts each evening around 7 o'clock. And it's a mixture of music, live acts, bands, and chefs broadcasting from their restaurants. The idea is it's helped support people stay at home, but also help support those businesses that are not being active at the moment because of the cut down of social distancing and the cut down of restaurants and bars and music venues having to close. So it is something that I believe started in Europe that Manchester's adopted. I've not yet seen it in any other city in the UK, so it'll be interesting to see if others follow suit. But it's been a really positive initiative, and it's had some really good feedback in terms of people joining in and getting involved in it. So it's another big tick for Greater Manchester trying to do their best with what's the situation that we're in. The only other two things I'd mention around what's been happening in Greater Manchester has been the Mayor has again been using his soft authority to challenge the government on what's happening, and also to challenge businesses to help with the crisis. The first was around communication firms and asking them to make sure that they put a cap on costs of their phone bills, particularly for older and vulnerable people. That actually took place, if anyone didn't see it, following a phone in that Andy does regularly with Radio Manchester, where a lady rung in to explain how her phone is her only way of communicating. She doesn't have the internet, she doesn't use anything like we're using today. So on the back of that, Andy made a very strong plea to businesses who deal in telecoms to say please cap them. Now some had already done that. I know BT had already announced that, and he's called on others to follow suit. The other thing is Andy again has written to the Chancellor setting out his concerns around support for the self-employed, asking the Chancellor to go further around supporting those, particularly those who are sitting in the loopholes around self-employment, who don't get as much support as those who have been in business or have been active in business for longer. So Andy's still pushing that case with the Chancellor and the Treasury. Moving on quickly to the national picture, as Ilona touched upon, the main news of this week, which really has dominated, has obviously been the news that Boris Johnson is in intensive care and is suffering from COVID-19 symptoms. Obviously, all our thoughts are with him and his family and all his friends as well. This is a very moving situation with updates coming quite regularly. At the moment, he is still in intensive care, having support with the use of oxygen, but no ventilator at the moment. Again, that will change pretty much quite quickly, and another one for us to just keep an eye on. That has meant that Dominic Raab, who is the Foreign Secretary, is now deputising for the Prime Minister. It has led to a lot of questions being asked by journalists around who is actually making decisions in government while Boris Johnson is in hospital. There has been a collective response to this. It's all about collective responsibility in cabinet, that the whole cabinet are working collaboratively and are working together if there are any major decisions to be made. Again, we'll have to see how long this period of time that the Prime Minister is in hospital, or certainly needs time to recover afterwards, to see what direction that heads in. But that is probably going to be at the top of most news agendas for the foreseeable future, and something to be aware of. So in terms of all government announcements that have been made this week, still a very strong focusing on sticking with the social distancing taking place. We are coming towards the end of the 3-week period where the lockdown was announced, and the government said they would review the situation. So it is likely that they will probably continue as we are doing at the moment. The governments have said that they would only change their position if the science clearly showed the UK had reached a peak in the curve. Now, at the moment, there is still conversations of when that peak is taking place. So unless it happens extremely quickly over the next couple of days, I think we can all expect that the lockdown will continue. How long that will be for, we don't know at the moment. Again, we are expecting something back later this week. In terms of support the government is doing, there's also been a number of updates that have been made by the government. They've increased the working tax credits basic elements, so that's gone up by £1,000 for people who are in receipt of working tax credits. They've also uprated child benefits, which is another important one for families. They're also one that we spoke about last week, that was a big concern, was actually brought up in questions as well, was around the support for the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, the CBILS. We had a number of questions on that last week. Now, that has been strengthened by the Chancellor, who has announced further support to firms affected by the coronavirus by changing the loan, which now it's going to be for all viable small businesses affected by COVID-19, not just those unable to secure regular commercial financing. They will now be eligible should they need finance to keep operating. So I know that was a big question last week. And we said keep an eye out. Change will probably come on that front. So that has been announced this week. Again, it is something that if you need further information on, I do recommend going through the Grove Company and the supports that Pro Manchester are putting on their website as well for further details. So that's another big important one. Some other big headlines as well that you may have missed or may not have missed if you've been keeping an eye on everything. There's been an announcement that the government are going to look to help protect the NHS by allowing people who are in prison and have 2 months left on their sentence to be released, but they will have to comply with strict rules and conditions, including wearing an electronic tag. So that is something they want to do to try and reduce the risk of a large outbreaks in prisons and to help reduce pressure on the NHS if that comes. There's going to be more Nightingale hospitals have been announced. We already know about the one in London and obviously the one here in Manchester, which is well underway for being prepared. There are also going to be one in Harrogate, and there's also going to be one in Bristol as well now. Two last things on the national picture. Local councils have now been given powers to hold meetings remotely. This is something that previously, when they had public meetings such as their full council meeting or planning committee meeting, they'd have to hold them in public so members of the public can attend, observe and potentially take part in. Now, they are now allowed to use video or telephone conferencing technology to run these to try and continue council's ability to work and to continue making the decisions that are needed at cities and towns across the UK and obviously here in Greater Manchester. I've not yet seen any exact details of how those are going to work here in Greater Manchester, but we will keep an eye out. And if anyone is particularly interested in how that looks, please get in touch and we'll see what we can do to try and help keep you informed on that. And finally, on the national picture, and crossing over to international, actually, the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference, which was due to take place in Glasgow later this year, that has now officially been postponed. There was a lot of focus for the government on that conference, particularly following issue around the environmental agenda that we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months. That has now been postponed and no date has been set for when it should be. So we'll wait and see what happens next on that front as well. Finally, absolutely finally for me, I promise, from an international perspective, we've had some latest details come through around the economic impacts across the European Union of COVID-19. Now, last week I spoke of some figures that we were given which were pretty bleak. Now, these ones actually, most recent ones, don't look as bad as that from the latest impacts assessments that have been done. In the European Union, the direct impact is estimated to only reduce real GDP growth by 2.5%. So that would imply it could fall just over -1% of GDP in 2020. So a lot of that is in line with the measures that the European Union and European states are focusing on to try and help get through the crisis. But again, we are still relatively early in this period of time. There's still a lot more going, and as we mentioned last week, that when there are issues that are brought up through the support schemes the government has set up, the government are looking at them and trying to see where can they provide that support, where they can extend the help. One thing that's still outstanding is support for charities, which I know, particularly here in Greater Manchester, we've got a lot of brilliant charities to support our communities and support businesses as well. And we are still waiting for those announcements from government. So we are expecting those in the next 7 days. So as soon as we have those, we'll make sure that details are put into our daily briefing and shared around. So that's the overview from the last week of what's been going on. As I said, there's lots going on, changes every day. But one of the biggest pieces of news that took place last week, which has had its limited news coverage because of everything that's happening with COVID-19 is the announcement of the new election of Sir Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party. Now, this is going to be quite a substantial change from what we had previously under Jeremy Corbyn, and particularly now, given that we are in the middle of this crisis, it's a really interesting time to have a new leader of the opposition. And that's why I'm really pleased and delighted that we've got Sue with us today, who is going to talk a little bit about Keir Starmer, talk a little bit about his role as leader of the opposition, and particularly in this crisis and what it means, and also to have a little look at the shadow cabinet that he set up. Now, Sue's background is she was a former shadow Secretary of State herself, so we're really lucky to have her today to be able to talk about it. So without further ado, Sue, if you're okay, I'll pass over to you for you to give us a little chat around all that.
Yes, thanks, Chris. Very, very pleased to be here. And as you say, Keir Starmer is going to be really quite a different leader to his immediate predecessors, not least because the Labour Party has now lost 4 general elections in less than 10 years. So he's going to have a real focus on getting the Labour Party back into power, bringing the party together and looking at how we achieve this. But as you say, interesting times as well to become the leader, not the usual way to start your career as the leader of the party. Keir and I came into Parliament at the same time at the election in 2015. So we started in Parliament together and worked pretty closely together fairly soon from the start. Towards the end of 2015, September, we were both in the Shadow Home Office team under Andy Burnham. Keir was the Shadow Immigration Minister and I was the Whip, which meant I got to know him very, very well because we worked closely on 2 very complex bill committees, which take up all of your time when they're sitting. And I got to see at first hand just how hard he works and his kind of a forensic approach to detail when working, which is going to be very interesting when Parliament is sitting again and we get to Prime Minister's questions, because Boris Johnson is not known to be a man of detail where Keir is. They're very, very different characters. So I think Prime Minister's questions is going to be pretty interesting and very different as we go into the future. Clearly, before he came into Parliament, he'd reached the top of his career as Director of Public Prosecutions. And we know he worked as a human rights lawyer before that, representing people like in the McLibel case against McDonald's. So we also know that he feels passionately about standing up for the underdog, that he holds traditional Labour Party values close to his heart, and he has a strong focus on social justice. So I was also then in Shadow Cabinet with him for nearly 3 years. We did actually have a very stable Shadow Cabinet for all of that time. And Keir clearly had the very difficult job of doing the Brexit talk strategy and standing up in Parliament, challenging government on that, which then meant that I became part of the cross-party Brexit talks, one of 4 Labour MPs involved in that. I was involved from the environmental and trading point of view, from food and farming. So again, it was interesting for me to see just how he works in those situations. He's someone who listens. He's someone who can take advice. He clearly carefully assesses every situation. And then when he's made a decision, he does speak and act with clarity. So he is going to be a very different leader, I think, to the previous leaders that we've had, in that he does come very much with that detailed forensic approach to what he's doing and how he makes his decisions. So what are his priorities going to be as the new leader? Well, clearly the top priority is the coronavirus. And we know from what he has said so far that he wants to work constructively with government. This is a time of national crisis. It's not a time for playing party politics, and he's made that very, very clear. However, at the same time, he has also said that there have been serious mistakes made by the government in their handling of the situation, And so he will be asking the difficult questions to hold the government to account when that's necessary. So he has, for example, said he would support the government if they need to put more restrictions on exercising outside of the home, that he would support the government if they felt that all non-essential workplaces had to be closed. But he's also said that he is setting up a COVID-19 shadow cabinet committee to look at the Labour Party's perspective on this and approach to holding the government to account, and also how they also support the government and work with government. We know that he's asked the Prime Minister for a meeting. We know that he has asked for access to Privy Councillors, and this has all been granted. But clearly, while the Prime Minister is in hospital, that has been put on hold. So we'll have to see the outcomes of that. But it's interesting as well who's in that shadow cabinet committee. We've got Angela Rayner, clearly as the deputy leader, Annalise Dodds as the new shadow chancellor, Lisa Nandy, foreign secretary shadow, and the shadow home office, which is Nick Thomas-Simons. Rachel Reeves is included. Of course, she will be standing opposite Michael Gove when we get back to Parliament at the dispatch box, and John Ashworth clearly as the Shadow Health Secretary. Interestingly enough, the Liberal Democrats have also called for a virtual Parliament select committee on the coronavirus that will be chaired by Keir and include members from all different parties. So I'm not sure if that's gained any traction, but it's interesting that their first choice of chair was Sir Keir. Keir's also spoken up about the fact that key workers have been taken for granted and have not been put at the forefront of what's needed to support them in the past, and that they need to be better paid and better supported, and also that the funding of the NHS really needs to be revisited, as does the whole approach to the economy. So we could see some interesting policies coming forward once this crisis has moved on. He's also said that the priorities that the Labour Party would like to see the government have regarding the COVID-19 outbreak is, first of all, to deliver the promised testing, I think 100,000 tests by the end of the month. So that's one thing he's focusing on. Also setting up vaccination centres right across the country, ready for when we have a vaccination ready. He wants to see increased PPE for NHS staff, and also that there needs to be a published exit strategy. And he has said that that exit strategy needs to be a combination of testing and vaccination. The other big priority he's got, of course, is Brexit, because despite all the challenges we've got at the moment with the virus, we are still due to finish all the trade agreements to leave the European Union by the end of the year. Now, Keir has already, before any of this happened, Keir had called this a very, very tight timetable. Clearly now there are further issues on how those negotiations are going to take place, not just because of the challenges we have as a country, but right across Europe. So it may well be that he says that we need more time to carry out those trade negotiations. The difficulty he has with that is that that may be viewed by some parts of the country, some political areas, that he is trying to delay Brexit, and that then causes him a difficulty in one of his next priorities, which is how do we win back the red wall? How do we win back those Brexit seats that were traditionally Labour that fell to the Conservatives back in December? So that's going to be a real challenge for him. And in many of those seats, mine included, it was very much seen as another referendum on Brexit, because the Member of Parliament had not supported Brexit when the constituency had. So that's a big challenge. Another issue, which is one that he raised in his acceptance speech, is how do we tackle the issue of anti-Semitism in the party? And it's been interesting that this week he's been praised by Jewish leaders for the conference call that he had with them and Angela Rayner to look at Labour's approach to tackling this problem. And I think the final big priority he has is that of party unity. One of the interesting things about the very start of his campaign was the nominations he had from members of parliament right across the different political factions of the party. And then that carried right across through the nominations from different constituencies and the people who've come in behind him, supporting him since. And then it's also interesting then when you look at his shadow cabinet that he has appointed members to his shadow cabinet from right across the different sections of the party. So I think that shows that he is serious about bringing people together, which is incredibly important, not just for the future of the Labour Party, but we need to have a strong opposition, particularly when you have crises like we have at the moment with the COVID-19. You do need to have a strong opposition, both to work with government and to challenge government. So that brings me on to the shadow cabinet. So who are some of the key people? Well, clearly Angela Rayner, she won the deputy contest and has also been made chair of the party. I mean, I've known Angela for, since, again, we were both elected in 2015. I know Angela very, very well. She's very passionate. She's very competent. I think she will be an excellent deputy leader and will support Keir well. And I think they're quite different characters, but I think they will work very, very well together for the party. We've also got some new faces. Annalise Dodds, who is coming in as the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, will be a new face to many people, although there is also continuity there because she was John McDonnell's number 2 in the Shadow team previously. And again, she knows what she's doing. She's a very, very safe pair of hands. Another new name to many people will be Nick Thomas-Simons, who's coming in as the Shadow Home Secretary. Again, he has been a Shadow Minister in recent years and he has a lawyer background, a barrister background, and again is a very passionate person. He's a very good speaker at the dispatch box, so he's going to be an interesting one to look out for. And of course, he's also brought in Lisa Nandy and Rebecca Long-Bailey, who were his 2 challengers for the leadership. Lisa Nandy as Foreign Secretary, and Becky Long-Bailey is coming in to do Angela Rayner's previous job as Shadow Education. Another interesting appointment is Rachel Reeves, who is the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. There are people within the Shadow Cabinet who were strong supporters of Jeremy Corbyn and backed him for his leadership. There are those who had not backed him for the leadership but accepted his leadership of the party and supported him as the leader. And then there are those who did neither, such as Rachel Reeves, who instead decided to concentrate on select committee work. And she has now been brought in as well, as I say, as the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. John Ashworth keeps his job as Shadow Secretary of Health, which makes absolute sense, not only because he's been very good at the job, but because why on earth would you change your Shadow Health Secretary at this time of a health crisis? Nick Brown as well, I think, is a good choice to stay as the Chief Whip. Nick has been Chief Whip under a number of Labour Party leaders, both in government and out, and is incredibly experienced, which will be important for Keir as a new leader to have someone who has that experience with him. But then, talking about experience, he's also brought in 2 people who've had senior ministerial experience, not least Ed Miliband, who of course was a previous leader, and he's now shadowing the Bayes team, which takes him back to when he was the minister in DEC under the Blair government and the Brown government. And then you've also got Charlie Faulkner taking us back to Blair, who, as shadow attorney, again brings an enormous amount of experience with him. So it's an interesting shadow cabinet, And also within it, looking at a kind of Manchester Northwest perspective, there are half a dozen members of Parliament from Northwest constituencies, not least Angela Rayner, who is the deputy leader and of course is the Ashton-under-Lyne member of Parliament. Lisa Nandy is Wigan, so she's also in the Northwest, and then as is Becky Long-Bayford in Salford. And then, of course, Jim McMahon, who's Cohen's Transport and is one of the Oldham MPs and a previous leader of the council there. Johnny Reynolds comes in as DWP, and also Kat Smith, who again was a huge supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, used to work for him, has retained her role as young people and encouraging people on voting. So it's an interesting shadow cabinet, some people who've kept their jobs, but many, many changes and a really, really broad spectrum. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this all unfolds, both during the COVID-19 crisis and when we finally get back to Parliament.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much, Sue. It's great to have somebody with such close insight, and obviously having worked with a number of those people personally. Now, as we mentioned at the outset, this is the section where we'd normally go to a few Q&As. Conscious of time, as well as the fact that obviously we don't have the live audience with us, we will bring this to a close now. But please do get in touch either with myself or with Chris for any questions either on the COVID-19 outbreak or on what we're expecting to see from the shadow cabinet, and we'll attempt to answer those. Just again to draw your attention to a few places for additional support. There are the Grayling daily briefings. If you're not already signed up to those, I do highly recommend them. It's a phenomenal job that they do every single day in tying together all the various announcements that come out. Pro Manchester has a COVID-19 support page with links through to all the local, regional and national support on different areas. And yesterday we launched a new Pro Manchester LinkedIn group for people who have either been furloughed or seen their self-employment impacted by the crisis. We set it up to say yesterday morning, that's already at around 100 members. So please do just do a quick search on LinkedIn for that, or let us know if you want the details. It's an opportunity for the network to continue supporting each other, and also a way for us to be able to get some advice and support out to people who are potentially not utilising work emails at the moment. We will be back hopefully live as normal next Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And delighted that we'll be joined by the co-chair of the Greater Manchester LEP, Mo Issap. So really looking forward to getting his views on how the Greater Manchester business community is reacting. So once again, a huge thank you to Chris and to Sue, and we will stop the recording there. Thank you ever so much for your time.